I think it's time for us
Is
to
it
do the
time?
work. It is. We need like
Yeah. Oh, I
a
see.
really
Well, I
cool call in or something. I don't know. We'll figure out a roll in here at some point.
wonder
We
if
got
we
some
could ever do a
rollouts.
call-in show. That would be really cool.
We totally could. We could even,
Nobody's going to call in though. That's the problem.
yeah, we need like two extra helpers to man the phones so we have that cool effect. The
We need producers so we can make fun of them behind the glass like a normal broadcast. That would be
yeah, that would
fantastic.
be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Someone besides you to mock. That's what I'm talking about.
Really, yeah, I could probably step off of the screen and have anybody else do my job.
Where's James when I need him? That's what we need. We just need to
He's
bring
on break
James,
this
sit him on
week.
the, huh?
He's on break this week. They've got
Sit him on the couch back in the back. That's what we need to do is to sit him on the couch back in the
give an
back.
iPad. Give him an iPad
Yeah.
there.
And we'll just pretend like James is our,
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah, he pretty much is anyway. So, Terry, how you doing?
Look, I'm great. I'm from home. I'm back to the old original studio, which is Craft Central and a mess, and my lighting's going to be like in and out because it's just insane in here. But so for the reason for that is we have snow.
What is that?
And we're snowed in. We didn't get the ice, but we got the snow. They didn't predict the snow for today, but we got snow. Everybody's at home, which means you're going to see people walking back and forth like always. You could do the the games, see how many points you get. And so yeah, we're snowed in a good whole half inch and we're stranded. Welcome to Alabama.
It'll be all right.
Man, I don't know.
So do you have your question ready for us today to kind of roll us
I
in?
do have a question ready for today's people are logging in and hopping on. Jay, the weather here is we have a half inch of snow. It's still snowing, and where Phil's at, I think he has 2 branches down.
Yeah, branches is a little overstatement. I've got twigs.
Twigs, yeah.
Twigs in the yard.
So, okay, so my question is, because it is a snow day for me, when it's a snow day for you, Phil, I'm going to tap into your foodie mind. What is the go-to snow day meal? That when it snows, you're like, this is what I want to eat because it's a snow day.
Wow, that's tough.
Snow cream doesn't count in the South because we don't have enough snow to make snow cream out of. Sorry, that just doesn't happen.
Right. And actually, that's not a thing for me historically. Like snow cream was just not something we ever did.
Just give me ice cream.
Now, growing up in Pleasanton, if you wanted snow, you drove there. And in an hour, you were in snow. I think it snowed once in my entire childhood growing up. So snow wasn't a part of age 0 to 18 by any, regular thing. But like your local friend there, I think chili probably is my go-to comfort food on any cold day. Snow days certainly fits into it as well.
Chili or a soup, right? I mean, that's got to be what it is. Chili or a soup. In fact, I think tonight is Olive Garden night at our house. We're going to have my favorite Zupa. Oh, so
Zupa
good.
Toscana.
And
Good call.
Yeah. And then she's making that other one I don't eat. Anyway, minestrone, I think probably that's what she's doing. I don't eat that stuff. I want the sausage and the potatoes and kale. Give it to me. So yeah, but I'm like you guys. I think a cold day like today, chili, soup, that's the way to go. I think we already had our homemade cinnamon roll breakfast, which is a good snow day thing because mom's home. So there you go. Chili's a good one.
Yeah, I'll probably add this as I've gotten a little bit older. When it gets to these snow days, I always get the itch to get out and see how much I can grill or smoke in the snow. And so when we have those really cold days, I get like motivated to like,
I don't have any meat, or I should have done that. Like, I think I could have, I should have taken something out of the freezer. I got some stuff in the freezer. I should have.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. That's more of like my make it into a challenge side of myself more than like, let's chill and relax.
Yeah. And speaking of smokers, I'm a little frustrated with myself. I forgot to put the cover on before the storm came through. So I got a little snow on top. It'll be fine.
Fire it up.
Yeah. Fired up, melt it off,
clean it up, use it as a cleaning opportunity.
Yeah.
Scrub the grill.
Yeah.
All right. So it's time for us to switch over. We got to put away some of that fun and have a little bit of a serious conversation for
based on the topic. I'd rather talk about the fun stuff for a while. Let's be honest.
Yeah. So I want to touch in on a couple of really important from the preacher perspective concepts today. And we're talking about deformed sexuality, and the church. And well, this is what I mean by it. We're talking about at least two really important spiritual challenges. One of them is an all the time, all the things issue. We generally use the term like worldliness as a blanket term, but in general concepts, this pressure to walk away from whatever God teaches and do whatever you want in the narrow confines of sexual relations has always created conflict in the lives of Christians. Like if you go read through your Bible from Genesis to Revelation, there are constant struggles with human sexuality, human attraction, and then the relationships that are either built or destroyed because of those conflicts. And dealing with it is always challenging. And so we're going to try to really carefully explore at least three areas today. The first area is really simple: building a behavior model. You could say rules, you could say intentions that help strengthen and protect the preacher in his home life. And then secondly, we're going to look at it in the role of the preacher as they relate in the congregational setting, same things. And thirdly, we're going to talk about it, the preacher's teaching in light of some of these challenges. My approach and mindset is also in this, that no matter what extra roles an evangelist has in a local church, deacon, elder, you are by default a leader in the church. You speak the most. That means your words, because of their volume, probably carry an unnatural weight to them. So this is a point where you have to be really cautious, but really, really clear in dealing with some of these things. And I'll say on my side, especially as a younger evangelist, I wasn't aware of the need for me to be clear. And then that was sometimes falling into the trap of, now I'm not clear, and some of the things I'm saying probably did more harm than the intended good that I planned for them, on a revelation type of thing. But that's what our basic layout is for today. And if you guys have comments or questions or insight, we really do appreciate them. We're looking forward to your interaction in those areas. Terry, that's what we've got on the table. Let's start with our first thing first and kind of think some of that through. So from the preacher's standpoint, I'll throw this really simple one out there that was given to me as advice by Warren King right when I determined I was ready to move into full-time work. And he just said the simple rule: just never be alone with women who aren't your spouse, aren't your family.
Also known as the Billy Graham rule, I think, in preacher circles today.
Right. And I don't know. I know in his case, it was born out of experience, that his advice was given, like, this is the things I've seen. These are the experiences that I've learned from other preachers. And that's the one, like, if you could remember anything that you didn't write down, but you remembered year after year, where you first heard it, and then where you followed to apply it, it's right there. And by the way, I extend that. I really try in my digital interaction, like texting, try to really keep that the same way as much as I can too. I realize that sometimes I can't control who texts me, but I can control what Jill gets to see. And generally, if you text me, Jill's going to grab my phone at some point and see most everything that's there.
Yeah, and I think the thing about that is even if there is communication through text, which is really, by the way, safe for the large part, my wife knows about that. I mean, as soon as I get that text, I'm probably going to say, "Oh, so and so texted me, and here's the question." And a lot of times it's just silly stuff. Like we have a deacon lives around the corner. I take their kids to school. Their wife, he's gone in the morning. His wife may text me and say one of the kids is sick. He's not going or whatever. Still, I'll just let my wife know. But as a general rule, I don't. There's always potential somebody show up at the building, a female. You have to be careful about how you handle that, right? I don't do that in a way. I think one of the things is not to go, stop, I can't meet with you. I think there's a way there's always some exceptions, I guess is what I'm saying. You got to be flexible, but I always try to include my wife in those things. And there's more than one reason for that, by the way, Phil. For me, it's not just as a protection for me and a protection for the other person. It's also just better for her, meaning the person who wants to meet, to have a female perspective involved in the conversation to begin with. So there's a lot of merit to this on a lot of different levels. But now look, what that means about never being alone could mean that if I have somebody who needs to meet during the day, my wife's teaching school, then we meet in a public place where we're not alone. Okay. Yeah. So that's how you handle that. And that's, by the way, that is not blaming women in that sense.
Right.
It's just acknowledging
the challenge.
This is a best practice. This is the best practice.
Let me add this, and this is part will come up in part 3 of our conversation, but I think it's one of the most important starting points for me is to recognize that in Job 31, Job talks about having made a covenant with his eyes.
Yeah.
And I think that's a powerful, better motivator than how sometimes the subject is discussed. The subject gets discussed by way of enticement. Like, well, this person may behave, act, or move in a way that is enticing to me in some way. The real thing is I've actually, really tried to lean into this. I've made a covenant with my eyes. I've made a covenant with my heart. And this is a me thing rather than an anybody else thing. This is my policy, my approach. And it benefits me spiritually, relationally, like it builds healthy relationships. It helps the relationships with my family. It also helps my relationship, like you point out, with whoever needs help. They're going to get more in a conversation if they're interacting with more than just me. And so there's a lot of good reason there. Plus, it doesn't place blame in inappropriate spaces. That's another benefit from it. We'll talk about that again in that third phase, if you will.
Yeah, and look, I think one of the issues in all of this is we've got to be very careful in how we handle this to make sure, and you're leaning towards this to the third phase, I think, but to make sure that we hold ourselves accountable instead of everybody else but ourselves accountable. And that's a really important thing for us to do. And that applies to every area, not just this area.
And let me add this. While we are approaching this primarily in a heteronormal area where it is opposite gender issues, there is no reason to not be wise enough to realize that not all interactions fall in that heteronormal spectrum. The Bible shows us that there is significant causal risk in all areas where, as the evangelist, as the thought and vocal leader in local churches, it's really important then to make sure that your personal space is presenting the right balance of biblical masculinity as well as care in all those other relationships. Because if you say, well, I just don't meet with women alone. Okay, historically, biblically, and in modern context, that's not the only safeguard that needs to be there. There are additional safeguards that all start within that realm of Job 31, variations of Proverbs 5, 6, and 7, which is probably the best text to teach about lust from heteronormal behavior, and also, expanding it beyond that. But I think it's really important to get that internal space set for the preacher as early as possible, because you can then make that disciplined approach to things. And then we add one more thing. There has to be some level of accountability. That's why, for me, in our relationship here at the house, Jill has complete access to anything. It's not because I am, I need her to double check on me. This is a relationship we want to have. We want to have a relationship where there's no boundaries between the two of us. And so she's got full access. She can ask about anything. I can ask about anything. It's a great, great thing for the evangelist and for the individual Christian. What else do you think, from your perspective, would be really important? I know I've read a few of the things. There's a lot of preachers I know that, even though they weren't struggling with this internally at an advanced point, they installed accountability software on their computers. That's certainly an okay thing to do. For my own personal reasons, I really make sure that my computer setup is pretty filtered. I don't want to get things I don't want. And so I built that into both our home network and then my own computing use, just because half of it has to do with distraction for me. Like, I don't want ads and trash because I want to stay focused on what I'm doing. And so it's time management more than it is spiritual management. But there's a second benefit, which spiritual benefit is a good blessing as well.
Yeah, I'll say this, that in my experience, if you can put a filter on your router rather than specific machines, you tend to be more successful. There's less ways around that. And that's just something for you to check into.
Nothing's perfect, but these are
yeah,
steps.
Nothing's perfect. Yeah. But that seems to be a more solid way to handle that. And look, at the end of the day, you can throw a lot of that stuff on there, but this is just the truth of the matter. If you want to get around that, or if your kids want to get around that, they figure out a way. We could do a lot of things about that, but at the end of the day, like you said, it's ultimately going to come back to being accountable and holding yourself accountable, and even extending that to somebody who will help hold you accountable. That's kind of the thing. And I'll say this. I think in the church, especially, one of the reasons that we have some issues is because, at least when I'm of the two of us, I'm the raised in the church kid. When I was growing up, we just didn't talk about this stuff. It was frowned upon, and the way we dealt with sexual issues in the most cases was we just ignored them. And I would suggest, even to the point that traditionally, like when we come to books like Song of Songs, there's such a tremendous level of being uncomfortable with that subject matter that we even created this awkward, terrible construction of that book to make it mean something it doesn't mean, which is this allegory of Christ in the church. And I'm not going to get too lengthy in that. I'm just going to tell you that when you look at Song of Songs, you should just be really comfortable realizing this is the Old Testament book about sex. Yeah. And what sex is supposed to look like between a man and a woman that are in love with each other. And if we'll do that, it is, in a sense, Phil, I think, liberating to realize God has discussed the issue and shown us what it should look like. And then when I fully extend that, you talked about earlier about being too general at times in your preaching. I think sometimes I made people mad by being too specific. I was on the other side of that because, and not that it was like a shock jock kind of approach, but these are things you need to talk about, and you try to word them in such a way that's not offensive. But at the same time, if you're going to talk about homosexuality, there's no good way to kind of disguise that other than talking about homosexuality. So we have either two choices. We don't deal with it, or we deal with it, and we try to do it as tactfully as possible, but we have to deal with it. And I'll extend that further beyond the pulpit. As parents, you need to deal with those issues and subjects in your home less tactfully than I deal with them in the pulpit.
Right.
And what I mean by that is you need to get more into specifics as parents, because both things here, Phil, I guess what I'm getting at too is if we don't deal with these issues, the world is, and they're going to take our kids and us down a path we shouldn't go down. And the only way to deal with that is communication. So communication is a valuable, important part of this to what we have to do in that standpoint.
Yeah. Edwin's got a long comment that I just quickly, browse through, and I'll say 100% about the accountability software and all those things. They're good, but not perfect. They're helpful, but they're not the end game. They are just really maybe a speed bump causing you to think. Let me add, Hal's got a good comment too, Terry. What you got?
Yeah. Well, I was going to go to Hal, but
let me slip something in there real quick. recently I got a conversation privately about questions like what exactly is the purity culture, and that's part of the reason that this
Yeah.
subject is for discussion today. I'll kind of quantify, like, that's a really wide area of literature and ideas, but I want to talk about one deformity within it to illustrate it. How many couples have we all encountered that when we sit and talk to them in various settings, they're going to describe it this way: that before they got married, the main thrust of their teaching in their settings was don't. Sex is bad until you're married, and don't. And then it shifted a little bit to phase two for those individuals. Women, like, wanting it is bad, wanting sexual relations is bad, and never say no, which are two contradictory things in some ways. But those are the two things that many young ladies were taught, both public from the pulpit, by the way, in some cases, but also from other well-intended but very poorly informed individuals outside of the public assembly. And men were told that your sex drive is so bad that the only spiritual solution for you is to get married.
And get married as
Because
soon as possible.
as soon as possible. That's dysfunctional. That will create dysfunction for the preacher.
Yeah.
In churches,
By the way,
and his teaching.
This is a huge problem in what has been in married couples when you have these kids raised in the church where the husband's taught you have this tremendous sex drive, okay, that can only be quenched by marriage. And the girl that he marries has been raised all of her life being told that sex is dirty, nasty, and gross. So then you bring these two people together and you have one guy who's told marriage is the solution to his sex drive, and you have this girl who's been raised by saying sex is dirty, nasty, and gross. Guess what happens when those two people marry?
Right.
One of their biggest issues is sexual.
They can't. The
They're
women
not compatible.
they can't enjoy it. They've been told, and how literally they've been said, until they never deny the sexual advances of their husbands.
Right.
This creates, that's like a narrow sliver in the larger pool or cesspool, if you want to use it, of the purity culture. It's primarily evangelical, but had ripples into various churches of Christ. So that creates.
By the way, Shane says here about the allegorical views of Song of Psalms. They don't necessarily undermine human sexuality. That is true. But we all agree that Shane, and this is where I've heard the most of the time, and I think you would agree with this, I've seen many preachers use them to completely avoid sexuality and only jump to this allegorical meaning and not deal with the language that is obvious there. And there's another way that Song of Songs has been misinterpreted. And I sat in a class years ago with an older preacher who was going through his dramatic interpretation of Song of Songs, and even with this stage right entrances and all this stuff, which was entertaining a little bit to me anyway. But at the end of the day, Solomon in this 3-person view was this dirty old man, and the woman was this pure as innocent as driven snow. And I just, asked the question, why could she talk about Solomon's body, or her beloved's body in his case, his beloved's body, the same way he talks about her body, Solomon does, and one of them's dirty and the other one's not? And that's where even that is kind of a form of purity culture coming into play there as well.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. And it doesn't, some of those can be elevating human sexuality. My point is, don't ignore the human sexuality of Song of Songs. It is so obviously there. You can't ignore it. Don't do anything to ignore that in that sense.
So Hal earlier commented this. He says, I've heard recently, you too, I bet, about more old charges against church elders for abuse and or ignoring others' abuse. I think hesitancy in addressing these things directly hinders our ability to find truth and chasten the true offenders. Absolutely. And let me cite this. I'm going to drop a link here for some of you. Hopefully everyone can see that. Jimmy Hinton, in his blog that I was kind of reading through about some of these subjects, makes note of this. With the exception of 2016, for the past quarter of a century, the number one reason for church litigation has been and continues to be sexual abuse. The very least that we can do is a better job of interviewing and screening candidates. And he gives a series of 6 questions that we might address here in a second in the church context, that I think really focus what is important. And I think there are a lot of challenges historically by poor leadership, weak leadership, in unprepared leadership in local churches that have not handled these subjects well. Um, and I'll put it this way: if your emotional approach to the subject of spiritual abuse in a local church is only deny, delete, defend, you're setting yourselves up for a cycle of abuse. Not an abuser, but a culture of abuse. It
And by the
doesn't
way,
mean that there's a privacy involved. It means if that's your only approach.
it's not only ironic but hypocritical that so many brethren have criticized the Catholic Church in the past for hiding the abuse within their religious organization. And at the same time, many of our local churches have practiced, in essence, the same thing when some of those things happen. And um, while it may not be on the news, the reality is there's a lot of things that have been not necessarily, I think swept under the rug, Phil, may be a bad way to do it. They've been dealt with privately to a degree, but they have certainly been covered up in the process. And we're not going to get into specifics of those stories, but there are stories where those things happen. It's not dealt with publicly, and that's an issue. And what we need to figure out, and I think this is where the Hinton article really comes into play, is the discussion needs to be about going forward. How do we handle this stuff?
Right.
When this happens, what's the response? There has to be some planning into all of this.
Right. Let me add this. One of the reasons that I'm not going to deal with specific instances is simply because I don't know the details.
Right.
And I lean into this perspective. If someone has the courage to make an accusation in these contexts, particularly a woman who makes an accusation, I am more readily situated to accept her accusation wholesale than to reject it because of the social pressure that exists for her to even reach that point. And so while there is statistically false accusations, the overwhelming weight of reality is that those false accusations exist in the extreme margins. And the weight then says that if an accusation is made, it must be approached as credible. Like there's just no way not to do that. And then you move forward from that. Edward, I'll get to your question about at least my approach to a definition for purity culture in a second, but I wanted to really include that as a component as we've shifted now into the church culture context. Let me add this too, also in the church culture context. If we believe biblically that male leadership is integral to the design of the universe and the design of earth and the design of local churches, then absolutely male leadership should acknowledge these things, be extremely accountable, be extremely transparent, and actually lead. I can get really fired up about it if we need to, but I think that's a really important thing just to hold on to. Like, look, if you believe those things, and I do, then you better take accountability for it, take the weight of it, and move forward. With that information. And I'll see your question about 1 Timothy 5 and other texts I think are similar in rationale and reason as well. But I think that's an important thing to kind of lay out there. Terry, before we get into the definitions of purity culture or some of these other questions, anything else you want to include in this middle space here about the church?
Well, I think you said when this comes up, you lean to accept the woman's view of a story, and I think that's good. I think one of the things that we need to do as a general rule in the response to these kind of things is our initial reaction, and I mean from people who don't have the details when we hear of these things, is to defend the church blanketly against any accusation. And we need to be careful in these areas of not doing that. Don't be so ready to defend the church that you jump essentially to victim blaming on a situation where you don't even have the details. Sometimes what we need to do in these situations is just not comment and step back and give time for the things to be, for lack of a term, discovered and looked into, and trust the leadership to lead that. And to preachers, you may play a part of that and you may not. And especially when you don't, one of the best things to do is try to create peace, try to encourage all parties involved, but allow things to work themselves out, to find the truth if at all possible, and not jump to defending publicly as much as possible either side until we can find the truth. And I think that's the hardest thing for us to do, Phil, is because sometimes we jump to defense and we find ourselves on the wrong side of the equation because of our passion to defend something without knowledge. So that's the hard part.
Yeah, one of the things I want to kind of expand forward a little bit is to first talk about the concept of purity culture and what I mean by that term. It's a loose definition. It has roots in a mixture of evangelical settings and certain theological convictions about the relationship of a man and a woman that in some cases, though not exclusively, I think are not matching the text. And it promotes an extreme view of abstinence, not biblical abstinence, but an extreme view of abstinence as the pinnacle of holiness, to the extent that in some instances, someone who has sinned and then falls short of the glory of God is a lesser candidate for a marriage than someone who in this area did not sin and fall short of the glory of God. I think it ruins biblical redemption as a model. It creates a false perception of what a relationship can look like. And in a realistic way, it intertwines this non-biblical construct as a new ideal rather than redeemed creatures who are then joined together by God. That's not the whole spectrum of things that might get categorized historically under the purity movement, but it would include some of the books written like I Cascading By, Love Waits, not every single jot and tittle of the book, but the ending thrust of them.
Let me be very clear about this. The purity movement as a whole had very good intentions, and that doesn't mean that they were right. And I think one of the things that we struggle with people who want to go, well, why are y'all blaming the purity culture? As a general rule, if you look it up, the purity culture is going to be a movement among evangelicals that promoted abstinence. And so then if we say something negative about purity culture, you're going to jump to the conclusion, well, Phil thinks abstinence is not something you should teach, which is not true. Okay. The problem is the way the purity culture preached abstinence. The way they tried to enforce abstinence was not really through personal accountability. It wasn't through creating a relationship with God where you saw this as something that you did. It wasn't through really teaching about what marriage looks like and the preservation of yourself for marriage in that sense. It was all about if you do this, you become a spiritual leper, essentially. And it was shaming. It was very much about shame. It was very tied into the shame honor idea. But look, if you went out on a date with somebody by yourself and you kissed them, all of a sudden now you're being shamed for that.
Right.
That was what the purity culture did. And it very much, Phil, I mean, I don't know, I'm going to throw this out here. In a lot of the publications, one in particular about dealing with men and lust, a lot of times it pointed a lot of fingers at females for their behavior being the cause of men's lust, rather than really dealing with men's failure to make a covenant with their eyes and control themselves as being the problem with lust. And it kind of goes back to what Edwin said earlier. Look, accountability partners, accountability software, all those kind of things, those are aids. But the problem about those things is they're not victory. And the purity culture was really making the aid the victory. It was the purity ring. It was this, it was that, but it didn't teach real victory. And that's the ultimate issue with the purity culture.
Right. And here's another way to think about it. And this is the moment when I first started paying attention to the details in the baking of the cake. In a sermon on the subject of modesty, the statement was made in essence, and I'm synthesizing down the whole thing, is that if a woman dresses inappropriately and is then assaulted, she bears part of the blame. If she dresses like a harlot, why is not the worldly context of treating her that way? It's a misappropriation of some of the texts from Proverbs, and it misses the entire mark of what really should be the focus of that message. And here's the thing. If you're a young lady listening to that message, it's really easy to come away, whether the intent was there or not, with the idea, like Mark Russell points out, that this sin is my fault.
Yeah, when a girl got pregnant at church, she got blamed, right? I mean, that's what happened during this time. And I think it's really, really, and Shane talks about this, that the purity culture is a really broad thing. The definition is so broad it's become a catch-all on that.
Yeah.
So, for instance, let me say, he says it's best to be specific about his objection rather than use that phrase. Phil brought up the attire of a harlot and modesty. I can tell you that the way I've taught modesty in 25 years of preaching has changed drastically. That I bought into that traditional approach of, and even probably said at one point, I remember, I think, saying, you know, when men complain about how women are dressed, that they can't focus while they serve the Lord's Supper, that's a problem. Well, it is a problem. But the problem's not the woman that's dressed that way as much as it's the man who can't control his lust. And what we did was we pointed our finger at the woman for years, dress better, dress better, dress better. And we didn't say, dude, get your mind out of the gutter, right?
Right.
And that doesn't mean that the one, by the way, that doesn't mean that there's not a need of the need to dress appropriately. But when I talk about modesty now, I'm going to go to Proverbs chapter 5, and I'm going to talk about the intimate relationship between a man and his wife. And the reason why you dress modestly is because that's something that's reserved for your husband or for your wife. That's how I'm going to teach modesty. And it's a completely different approach, Phil, than what we've done in the past. And Hal brings up, we had this discussion recently online, I did at least, somebody. The problem is men who blame Bathsheba and women who blame David. And like, for instance, one thing that recently came up, here's another traditional misteaching. Well, Bathsheba's at fault because she was on the roof. Go read the story. Doesn't say Bathsheba was on the roof. The only person that's on the roof is David. Bathsheba's taking a bath where she always took a bath. David's the one that shouldn't be where he was at.
Well, and here's part of this. My first step in addressing this was to be balanced. If I'm going to focus on modesty issues for women, I'm going to focus in on modesty issues for men, because biblically, men and women, regardless of what culture says, biblically, men and women are equally enamored with the opposite gender. If you read Song of Solomon, you learn that that's the case. And here's my short commentary on Song of Solomon. Anything that sounds like it has some level of sexual innuendo in it does.
Not only does it have sexual innuendo, it has more than you realize.
Right.
That's
simply
the truth
does.
about Song of Solomon.
It simply does. It's just a fact of the text. Regardless of allegory, it's just a fact of the text, as I see it. So that was my first step, like when we balanced. But then, like Terry, I think it's really important to move into that Proverbs 31, Job 31, Proverbs 5, 6, and 7 space when dealing with these issues and thinking, okay, what's going on inside the heart of a person? Because I can tell people who care what God thinks we should wear. But I don't live solely in a world where everyone around me cares like God cares about any of these things. So in the end, I've got to build a structure that says I can make a uniform commitment with my eyes to do things better. I cannot avoid temptation. I cannot leave the world, but I certainly can move in a way that acknowledges personhood, that acknowledges the generality of all of these challenges, and that is being more mindful of them. And when people bring up bad biblical arguments that lean into this, like Shane points out, very specifically, we can respond and deconstruct what in essence is false teaching and instruct people on the wholeness of the text. whenever someone says, well, Bathsheba was to blame, or she didn't call out, and this is going to lead into our 1 Timothy 5:19 text, I can point out that structurally you're misapplying the text, because in that lead up session with Bathsheba, point to me the text where God declares that Bathsheba was accountable. And I'll point to you the text where David acknowledges that he sinned. Those are structures, that are textual there.
By the way, one of our issues with this is, real quick, like on David Bathsheba, we want to blame one person. Right. We want to point the finger at one person. Look, by pointing out David was wrong, nobody's saying Bathsheba's innocent. Like, I think that's one of our struggles we have in these things. No. It was like, seriously, both of them were wrong in that story. That's the point.
The latter part of Bathsheba is her dealing with a bad situation.
Right.
And a whole lot we don't know. And so I'm not going to put any extra weight on a woman than what's already in the text. Just like I wouldn't do that to a man. Like, it just literally, it's just not fair. And here's that tie-in. Hal asks a very great textual question. In 1 Timothy 5:19, the text indicates that accusations toward an elder should exist on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses, appealing both to the cultural structure of evidentiary process, and then that leaves us the question, is this a paradigm that has to be used in all settings, that whenever there's an issue, it can only be settled if there are 2 or 3 witnesses? And biblically speaking, the answer to that is already a functional no. Because if one person admits that they did a thing, there's no longer a need for witnesses. If you go to your brother and your brother confesses that sin to you and you work it out, going back to Matthew 18, looking at some of the New Testament texts that way, we already know that's the case. That ties into the Deuteronomy text, which is often brought into this. And I think Edwin kind of hinted at a little bit in regards to crying out, which again is not a paradigm that must exist in all instances for this to be the case, because there's a lot we simply don't know in any of these accounts. Further, it's not always necessary. It's a limited context, a limited space, which is used in limited instances. And so,
well, look, here's the problem with 1 Timothy 5 is I think we've misinterpreted 1 Timothy 5, if I could just be blunt and make this simple. The idea of witnesses in 1 Timothy 5 doesn't mean they witness the charge against the elder necessarily. Because in Matthew 18, you take witnesses into the process in a private function. Before the charge against anybody in Matthew 18 is brought public, there have to be witnesses. And that gets to what you just said. If an elder admits something in private and he doesn't change it, and you take witnesses and he doesn't change it, those witnesses go with you to the church. Like 1 Timothy 5, and what that is the preacher in this case. Mm-hmm. So the point being that 1 Timothy 5:19 doesn't mean that no elder can ever be held accountable unless 2 or 3 people saw them sin. It means you don't take a charge public until you've worked out the process of Matthew 18, which, by the way, applies to even non-elders. What 1 Timothy 5 really clarifies is where to take the charge once there's a charge to go public. And we missed that up. I'll put my soapbox back under the desk at this point.
There's another important factor to bring into play. You're often balancing civil obligation and spiritual obligation. And someone said, well, wait a minute, we're supposed to not bring our cases to civil Gentile courts. Why can't we settle these in-house? Well, there's a difference between property issues and criminal conduct and true abuse. And you have limitations. So there's some things that I would love to be able to do that are not my right to do. And probably it's good for me spiritually that I don't have that right. Because there are people, there was a joke book over the years, is people I want to punch in the face. It's probably good that I don't have the responsibility of punching people in the face for my own spiritual well-being. Even
I prefer the throat.
But I'm trying to be, I'm using verbal modesty in this case. But I think that's an important factor to bring into play, because look, in various other non-church roles, I have written obligations of report. Serving as a volunteer, if I see things that fall into the category of suspicion of assault or abuse, I have a duty to report. That duty to report is immediate.
And if you're like me, by the way, Phil, I'm a manager on a soccer team. It means I oversee stuff and all that. I have to take a training session every year about, and let me tell you, when I look at that, it's like, man, this is the same stuff as last year. And it is the same stuff as last year. Okay. I have to do that every year in order to be certified. And you do too, probably, with Boy Scouts and everything else. It is an annual certification we have to take. If you see any form of abuse, you have to report it, or you could be held accountable in that process.
Right.
And one of the things that is missing in our churches is that kind of training, by the way.
Right. So I think that's kind of a process that kind of lends into this mixture of church space, teaching space we've been talking about. And I think here's another way to think about it, because we do talk about this sometimes. In the interview process, when you're discussing whether it would be a good fit for you to work with local churches, very often I've suggested, and I practice the idea of, let's talk about discipline in a local church. How has the church approached that, especially with the elders? Like, how did you work through that? What was your process? In those conversations, I'm generally less concerned with the individual instances and more concerned with the process they use to navigate. How do we go from step to step, and what do we do, and what do we encourage the local church to do? Because I want to make sure that I buy into that. Because again, as that vocal part of the church's leadership, I'm going to be supporting that process in the future. And in those questions, and I'm not going to read them all for sake of time, but if you go to that Hinton he's got 4 or 5 questions in the larger space that deal with basic situational concerns.
Case studies. He has case studies in there. Yeah.
Right. And in that context, it's the same stuff that takes place in the youth protection training that Terry and I do of various types, where like, okay, this happens, what do we do? You need to know that the process they use in discipline is going to be spiritually healthy for at least 2 segments of the church's population in that case. One, it's going to be healthy for you. That the process that's put in there is not only going to protect you from harm, but it's going to protect you from self-harm. Like, they've got a process that creates an environment where you'll be spiritually stable. Secondly, the other group is it's going to be all the vulnerable parties in the local church. And vulnerable parties don't all look the same. They are both genders, all ages, and generally they're the ones that don't have the power. And I'll be very specific in this case. Very often, due to the demographics of local churches, the people who do not have the power are the people who aren't related to the larger majority of the church. Because in many local churches, they are very patriarchal, very matriarchal, or very single family unit. And so they have to have a process to protect against abuse in those areas. I think that's really important. If a congregation has 4 elders and 3 of them are brothers/brothers-in-laws, that creates concerns where the process may need to be aware of it. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means you make sure that you have a balance there, that there is not going to be some tilting of the table so justice gets delayed, because that destroys faith, it destroys individuals, and it could destroy you. Terry?
Yeah, so along those lines, a couple of good comments, and I think you talk about power. David Edwin says in there about the abuse of power, and even points out that's why in any case where there's a preacher involved, his power makes him the guilty party in that sense. And I think that's something that we need to realize. We understand that, by the way, when it's a school teacher, right? We get that when it's a school teacher. And I also think back to the Romans 13, just as a general rule, churches should never cover up criminal activity. I mean, and the discussion in Corinthians about civil cases and handling them in-house does not give the church the right to cover up criminal activity. And that's, as a general rule, that's something you got to know. And what's happened in the past is the church has not only done that, but then the family feels pressured to go along with that and loses their voice because they're not in authority. And I think one of the reasons, just to be very blunt, why this is so important is we often talk about, if we could spend $100,000 and it would save one soul, would we do it? And, oh yeah, of course we would do that. But there are souls that have been lost because of how churches handled sexual misconduct over the years. And if they would have handled them better, those souls would not be lost, probably, because it is a part. And Phil, you and I have had conversations with people who mentioned that is the turning point in their faith, because they were sexually mistreated in the context of the church, and it was mishandled, and that resulted in them walking away from their faith eventually.
Yeah.
That's why this has to be dealt with, and that's why it has to be considered, because there are souls at stake in all of this. And I believe, and I think you do, Phil, as well, that person chose to walk away from their faith because of this, but there's some people who still pretend to be faithful who may lose their soul in the end because of how they handle some of these things.
Right.
And
you can think about it really pointedly and just say, how many souls would be saved if the abuser was fired and not rehired?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the abuser is never welcome in spiritual environments, but they should not be elevated to roles of leadership. And I think that's a struggle. And there's going to be internal conflict there, because Jesus teaches us to be forgiving. And then we struggle, like, what does forgiveness look like? Forgiveness is rarely, in the sense of the New Testament, placed in any realm where we would have a lever to force. Like, we can beg and draw. But forced forgiveness isn't forgiveness. If we make someone act like forgiveness has taken place, we're doing as much injustice to the text as we would complain about in any other area. If someone tried to warp a text from the Old Testament and say this is New Testament law, we'd say, no, that's right. You're not handling the word properly. You're doing an injustice to the text. Same thing is true about these other areas as well. And I think there's a lot of space. I'd encourage folks to read the lectures that both Steve Wolfgang and Betty Wolfgang did, dealing with pornography, that were published through Truth Magazine's lecture series a few years back. Those are really good, excellent. Their series that they do on marital conflict touches on some of these subjects as well. Leaving the Pit deals with this a little bit further in those areas. There's a lot of good areas that we can go to get more information. If you want to talk about broader human sexuality, there's tons of good work that's been written over the scope of humanity that also deal with some of this stuff, to kind of like dig through some of these issues.
Well, and let me say this for married couples that may deal with some of the results of the mishandling of at least how we teach about sex. I think one of the great resources out there today is a podcast by the name of Intimate Covenant. And it is taught by a former classmate of mine and Phil's, Matt Schmidt, and his wife, Jen, out of Houston, Texas. And I think I've promoted that before, but Intimate Covenant is a really, by the way, blunt broadcast, deals with some things that nobody else will deal with, but from a very godly perspective. And they do a really good job dealing with that stuff. I highly recommend that. They do also do weekend retreats, which are great, and workshops and those kind of things. But I really would recommend for married couples to hop into the podcast of Intimate Covenant. It comes out once a week on Monday.
Right.
You and your wife can listen to it separately and discuss it later.
Right. I think that's probably a good guest host event. Maybe we
we could probably set that up.
Maybe we'll get James on that. Our metaphorical public.
Our scheduler, our producer, James, is going to work on getting that set up for us.
Yeah. Any last thoughts, Terry?
Hey, look, look, this is it's a serious topic, obviously, and I think one of the things to keep in mind about all of this is that this has caused a lot of devastation in our culture, and it's caused devastation in the church. But at the end of the day, the important thing to remember is Jesus is a great physician who can heal and who can save from even sexual sins, who can restore, and who can even restore relationships that have been broken if we will just handle things in a way that glorifies God and leans on the wisdom of God. And one of those is to always be truthful, to always promote truth, and not to be deceptive. And I think that's just a really important thing as we go forward in our churches, to be open and honest about things, and not to be deceptive about these kind of things.
Yeah, I want to answer Connie's question. She asked to clearly state the name of the podcast. It's the Intimate Covenant Podcast. I've dropped the link into the information. But Connie also,
IntimateCovenant.com, by the way.
But Connie, I'll also send that to you directly so that
Yeah.
there's no questions there. This is a complicated subject. There is a lot of things that we could have covered that we did not, and so we will probably address some of those in the future. You'll notice that I used some terminology like heteronormal, and I think that's a term that's important because we do not, at least in my experience among the churches of Christ that I've been connected to, and the Christians that are in those various assemblies, deal with subjects of sexual attraction outside of male-female attraction holistically or accurately. That's an area of growth that we need to get better at, so that we teach in healthy ways, and really, folks, give folks a chance to hear the gospel that may not listen unless we learn to speak with that level of clarity and compassion. And so
compassion is the key there, right? And our response tends to be either one of two things: we get politically charged about these subjects, or we just straight up mock them. And both of those fail to share the love of Christ with the person we're talking about.
Right. If you're looking for some reading, Preston Sprinkle in that area would be a starting point, but not the only one. If you want my reading list, I'm happy to share what I've read. I think I shared it with Edwin. And there's a lot of stuff you can read in that area that can really give you seeds to grow a good forest of ideas. If there's other ways we can help you in your work as an evangelist, the work of a local congregation, if you got questions about preaching, let us know. We're happy to chat. But on this day, we encourage you to stay warm, particularly if you live within I don't know how many other states who are having a snow day. We're not having one here. And I heard in Florida, it was like 75 or 80 degrees yesterday. So,
and in Texas, they woke up to negative degrees and rolling blackouts and brethren who have no power. And so prayers for the people, especially in the southern states, that just, quite frankly, they don't have the equipment and the knowledge to handle this storm. And that's part of the issue.
Yeah, like it's just so far out of their normal area. So we want to make sure we pray and encourage. If there's something we can do, let us know. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.